Welcome everyone to Rising Out of the Chrysalis Stories That Inspire with Marissa Grace, where we share life stories of struggle and triumph, not only of my own life experiences, but also through the experiences of my own guests, as a way to help you have breakthroughs and find hope in your own life. Welcome everyone. Today I have the pleasure of introducing you Jilly Maria. Thank you, Jilly, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, Jilly, you have quite a story actually, because it started at a pretty young age. And it started when you lost your dad. So take us back to early on of your childhood and tell us, what happened.
Sure. Thank you for having me, first of all. So my parents split up when I was 4, and my brother was 2, and we started going to my dad's in New England and to see my dad and my stepmom for probably 3 months out of the year. And we lived with my mom the balance of the time, and there was a huge disparity in lifestyle and income, all those things. And one of the hardest things that I realized looking back on it now, and even then I remember, living into certain things where, for example, my stepmom would expect me to know things that a 6, 7, 8-year-old child wouldn't know, had no reason to know. And I realized very quickly on that not only was I my brother's protector, whether I wanted to be or not, and I love my brother very much. But I was also in a space where I had to protect myself from things. And it was one of those things where I felt like I was walking on eggshells as a child. And that's a really hard mental and emotional place to be. It's also hard physically. And a lot of times we don't realize that because we're so busy trying to be in the moment and just survive one moment to the next that we don't realize what's really going on. And I was in a space of having a stepmom who was emotionally and mentally unstable, and she could go off at any time. And she would make, and I don't remember even how this happened, but a particular memory comes to mind where she would make mountains out of molehills, and she would get ridiculously upset and drag things on and keep bringing things up that were like, it's over with. And I'm not saying that that we should bury those things or not talk about them, but I'll give you an example. I was at home and I was in the kitchen, and she either instructed me to make coffee or instructed me to get her a cup of coffee. And, the coffee pot that they had was still percolating. And so it was like, well, it's still doing whatever it's doing. Like, it's not ready yet. It was like, get me a cup of coffee. So I made a mess. Coffee went all over the floor, got burned by the hot coffee, whole thing. And, it became a whole thing. Like, why didn't you do this? And why didn't you do that? And things that, again, adults asking children for things that children don't have any way of knowing. Like, if you don't know a question to ask, you can't ask the question. And so there was a lot of mental abuse. There was a lot of emotional abuse. And again, people who are hurting, hurt people, hurt people. And so it moved into a space where when I got into my teenage years, like, I didn't want to visit. I didn't want to see them. I felt like my, dad was in a space where he wasn't doing his job to protect me. And it's really hard when people are emotionally absent. And because a lot of times, parents, especially when they're working multiple jobs or when they're a single parent, or they'll say, I'm trying my best. And it's not that they're not, they absolutely are. But, I realized, in recent years in my life that neither one of my parents were emotionally present. They were not emotionally available. And through no fault of their own, they grew up not having emotionally available parents. And one of the things that happened among all of that was sexual abuse and being molested as a child, and multiple circumstances where that happened, and not being able to really say anything because, the child in me was very afraid that I was going to end up in a space where I didn't know what was going to happen. And, there were certain places where I was willing to take chances in my life. But I felt like I already effectively lost my dad in that he was on the other coast. He was not in my life on a day-to-day basis. And I was terrified of also, not having anyone believe me. Right. And I think one of the things that kids do is they try to protect their parents. And they try to also protect their turf in the sense of like, I already lost one parent, I'm not going to lose another parent. And, we do go through as children, we don't know the big picture. So
Right.
my little brain being in the space of like, if I say anything, first, I'm not going to be believed because it's going to be he said, she said. And the second thing is going to be, what if something happens to my mom and she's not there? What if something happens to my dad and he's not there? And, who's going to raise me? What's going to happen? Now, these are not conversations that you're having consciously. This is just, I'm not going to tell anybody. Therefore, I'll keep myself safe.
Yes. I was going to say, at that point, you were already emotionally damaged,
Yes.
right? You had already been through that trauma of being emotionally manipulated.
Yes.
And you already had formed certain beliefs that, okay, in order to protect myself, because if I go out and say something, nobody has really believed me in the past. I got punished for that. So now if I go and say something, I might get punished for this too. So to keep me safe, I'm just going to stay quiet.
Yeah. And that's, the hard thing too is I think a lot of times kids don't look at, when you're in it, you don't look at it as emotional abuse, right? You don't look at it as, because we think of, it has to be, and it was loud and screaming at sometimes, but we have an idea in our society of what abuse looks like. And if our experience doesn't fit into that mold, if you will, we then have a tendency to think, okay, well, it wasn't that, it wasn't abuse, or it wasn't that bad, or the person that did it, I was doing the best I could with what I had. So don't do this. Don't find fault, whatever. As opposed to saying, this happened, this affected me. And I realized it created these patterns, as you said, of behavior, of you're trying to be in a space of, like, it created in me rampant people pleasing. Um, it created in me the notion of this. I had this huge abandonment wound. And the flip side of the abandonment wound was that I stayed in situations, whether they be work, romantic, familial, social situations, way longer than was practicable, was good for me, was good for anybody involved, like way burnt out. And I also had a very early on piece where I would feel like I had to have a story as opposed to just saying yes or no. Like I didn't understand until probably 10 or 15 years ago that yes and no were complete sentences. And I didn't have to have a whole story. And I think that's a really important piece for anybody that's gone through trauma. Is society tries to minimize our trauma because you can't see emotional and mental trauma. And so we try as a society to minimize it, and because we also don't understand it. So the generation before us didn't learn how to be emotionally intelligent, so therefore they have no skills to just hold the space for us to feel angry or feel whatever we're feeling. So it's like, oh, it wasn't that bad, as opposed to saying, whether your T was little T trauma, like something that's happening continuously to you, or big T trauma, like, being raped or assaulted, or having somebody physically, committing domestic violence on you, or things like that. And, bigger T trauma, it's still trauma, and it still registers in our nervous system. It still registers in our physical body as trauma. And a lot of us don't know that. So then we have physical health problems that start happening. And our autoimmune issues is a huge one. And we all sit going, well, how come, and then Western medicine can't figure it out because it doesn't show up on tests. And then we're like, well, how come you're feeling, oh, but it's just in your head. And it's like, well, it's actually in your body.
That is very true. And you bring out a really good point because the generation before, our parents, family members, um, they are brought up in a certain culture, and still around today, there are cultures that suppress of you speaking out how you feel, how you're hurting. And you're supposed to just, pick up yourself and continue going.
Yes.
Pull up your big pants, be a big girl, and put a smile on your face like nothing happened and go on with your life.
Yes.
Don't let the neighbors see you cry. We don't want the neighbors to see there's anything going on in our house. Put that big smile on, pretend everything's okay, and go on with your day. Forget about what happened, it already passed. All those things, that this culture that has been going on from generation to generation, actually all it did was teach you how to suppress emotions
Yes.
and not
And
really help you.
yeah, and I think that's, really dangerous in terms of, you know, when I work with clients now, and I'm, end up saying, okay, you're going to be the cycle breaker. And I end up saying, okay, this is not going to be easy and it's not going to be fun. But a lot of times what we do is we go the exact opposite from the place of suppression and repression to, one of the things that I see people do a lot of times is go and have this like confrontation where they're like verbally vomiting everything out. And the parents or grandparents that they're speaking to, or the elders or whatever they got in their culture and their familial, space, is they have no idea how to handle it and they're equally
Right.
terrified. So they're in a space, and it creates this very crunchy, very toxic dynamic where it's like, well, I don't want to heal, I don't want to hear it, because they don't know, and they're in that same fear that you are trying to push through. And so it becomes this very toxic dynamic very quickly, as opposed to being in the space of, if I allow myself to feel my emotions here and I get used to being, everything is not okay. And what can I do to get to okay? How do I feel my emotions? And I teach myself all those pieces, or I, work with a coach or a counselor or a therapist and learn those pieces so that I can self-care, so that I can take care of myself and get myself back regulated again. Then I can say, hey, I would like to have a conversation with you at some point, such and so forth. And I mean, I've done that in my family where I've said, hey, um, I've been working on this particular piece in my life, and I've come to realize this, this, and this. And I would like to talk about this if it's okay with you. And I see where, you know, this happened to you and you didn't know how to do it, or you didn't have any idea of, you had no skill set. I can't teach someone to boil water if I don't know how to boil water.
Exactly.
And a lot of times we're in the space, and I tell people all the time, the reality is when you were born as a baby, you knew how to poop and pee, sleep, eat, and look cute. Those are the things you were born inherently knowing how to do. Everything you know how to do in life, whether it's brushing your teeth, boiling water, washing dishes, driving a car, vacuuming, putting on clothes, things that we now do, we don't now do rotely, getting in the shower, etc., etc. Everything you know how to do, somebody taught you how to do. So the flip side of that is that if you don't know how to feel your emotions, if you live in a household or a religious, dichotomy, or you live in a cultural dichotomy where they don't talk about emotions, they stiff upper lip, shoulders back. They put on social media happy faces, and no one ever knows if, things are going sideways or whatever. They're completely surprised that that person's getting a divorce, although the people behind the scenes knew that those people have been yelling and screaming and slamming doors for 20 years. Or, those pieces is we get to come into a space of quiet first and foremost, so we can hear ourselves, so we can then go, okay, what do I need? Because one of the things that I did for a very long time is I needed to have lights. I needed to have, like, I would a lot of times would have my TV on mute, and I would have the radio going. Like, I never had silence. And I always had something going on in the background. And I got to a point one day where someone said to me, what happens if you have complete silence? And I was terrified of complete silence, because what was I going to hear? What was I going to get to know? Where was I going to come into space of those suppressed emotions, those situations where it was like, oh my God. And realizing, where there had been abuse, where there had been suppressed memories, where things, and here's the thing, you know, where had there been things in my life when it was like, that's just blatantly unacceptable. And here's the thing that's really important about it for me. And I think this will serve the, your audience as well, is when we realize things, it's coming into a space of aha and allowing ourselves to feel the emotion, allowing ourselves to, if you don't have, support of some variety, getting it, enlisting it, but coming into a space of realizing what I needed. So for me, it's like, did I need to be heard? Did I want to be witnessed? Did I want to be validated that yes, this happened? Or did I want to be in a space of, did I need an apology? Did I need someone to say, yeah, I did this wrong thing and I'm so sorry? And I'll give you an example. When my grandma was still alive, she and I had a conversation one day, and the long story short is she apologized to me, came out of the blue completely. And she said, the thing is that, she goes, I raised my children, my aunts and uncles and my mother in, during the world was on fire. She was a World War II baby. And so she's like, your mother was a World War II baby. And so the reality of it is the world was on fire. We didn't have the luxury of feeling emotions. She's like, so I never taught, and I will always regret that I never taught my children to feel emotions, right? I never taught them to, how to be emotionally expressive. And so, and it was, to me, that was such an, oh my God, because I wasn't looking for the apology first and foremost, but it was an important conversation because it taught me so much about,
Well, first she was aware of the fact that, it
yes,
took place. So, she was very aware, and the fact that she's aware of how it has impacted your life as well.
yes.
And it was probably something that, even though you weren't expected, it was needed for you to hear at that time.
Oh, 100%. And I think, what the thing is, the flip side of it is that I think a lot of times, like I said, the flip side is that a lot of times when we start doing our work, a lot of times what I see is people saying, well, I went and I had a confrontation with my mom, my grandma, my dad, my whoever, and it didn't go well. I'm like, well, okay, if someone comes at you and they're like, rah, 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 and they're screaming and they're yelling and they're accusing you of things and whatever, do you like it? And they'll say, well, no. I'm like, okay, then why would you do it?
Right.
Like, I understand that you're in the space where
you need to get it out. But if
yes,
you didn't like it in the first place, of when somebody, the adult, was yelling and screaming at you and you got trauma from that, you don't want to repeat that cycle.
correct. And being able to be in the space of saying, and it was funny because one of my friends that I'd shared this with had said, well, how did you get the apology out of your grandma? I said, I wasn't looking for it. I was just in a space of sharing something completely different. And my grandma had this aha about how she did things and how it affected me and how it affected our family. And sometimes we get to let people have that light bulb without having to be in the space of like, if you don't admit that you were wrong, rah, 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 and it's like, okay, but again, would you want someone to do that to you? No, you wouldn't. You would not want someone to be in that space. And being, and I tell people a lot of times, asking for the witnessing, saying it out loud for yourself is as important as, getting the validation from somebody that, because here's the thing is, if you grew up in a space where, inappropriate touching, where women were objectified, where, men were in a space where, like they believed when they got married, they could have sex whenever they wanted to, right? Like the wife had to give them sex, period. We did grow up in a place, there's a lot of people alive who have those beliefs because that's what was taught to them. So rather than being in the space of like, you're wrong, you're bad, blah, 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 what if we're in the space of, they don't know what they don't know, I know this new thing, and so I get to be in the space of saying, oh, well, we don't do that in our family anymore. Or I'm going to choose to teach my daughters that no means no. That I keep my pause to myself and I expect them to keep their pause to themselves, and I can walk away, because that's another piece, right? Is that we grew up a lot. I mean, I remember a lot of times when I was younger, being told, be a good girl, be nice. And, there would be people that just felt icky. Like they
Right.
just,
And what
I
does
didn't,
that mean to be good and to be nice? That's the
yes.
other confusing thing when adults speak to children. They don't realize that children don't have the thought process as the adults do. So when you say something like, be good, be nice, the
Yes.
child cannot process that and go, oh, do you mean be good and nice to grandma and grandpa or to everybody? Is it every
Yes.
adult? Is it every child? Because we're not explaining things correctly. That's the other thing. We just say
Yeah.
things, and that has happened to me too as a child, where I was left totally clueless and not understanding by those short words that was said. Don't do this. And that child's going, but what does that mean?
Hmm.
If I don't do this, what's going to happen to me? Something really bad's going to happen to me if I don't do it. So I'm never ever going to do it now. And the children are not able to set the boundaries correctly because they're not explained the words correctly. They don't know what those words mean. They don't know what anything means unless you actually explain it fully. But as adults, we're just expecting them to just know. I give
Yes.
you an order, you should just know and complete it, and
Yeah.
not realizing that the child is still growing. Their thinking process is still developing, and you need to speak to them in a way that they understand and are able to rationalize based on what they know in their environment.
Yeah. And I think, the short notions of like, be kind, be nice, and being in a space of like, if someone is, touching you inappropriately, or if someone is, saying things that are not appropriate, like teaching kids, we're so afraid of teaching kids the things they need to know, like saying the words, like if somebody touches you, below your waist, or somebody touches your boobies, or someone does this, that's not okay. And we have a tendency to think like, okay, they're just going to somehow know. And when I've talked to some people, I've had conversations with people where, as they're raising their kids, and I'm like, well, you got to tell them what the real body part is. You got to say like, hey,
Right.
this is not appropriate. And if someone does this, come tell me, because it's not okay. And we, a lot of times, again, like you said, we say things like be nice. We say things like, be kind to people and be a good girl. It's like, okay, but when I see women that are in their 20s and their late teens and they're being good girls, and then they get sexually assaulted or they get raped because they're so afraid of saying no. They're terrified of, what if people leave? And it's like, oh my God, but it got me hurt. And then they have that whole trauma piece to solve around that, as opposed to saying to somebody like, we want to be nice, but again, I'm not going to put my kids in the space of, if this person is acting inappropriately, like I want them to love everybody around them. At the same time, I'm not going to be like, everybody's just going to be a good girl and sit on Uncle so and so's lap if they don't know us. I mean, like when you're a baby, when you have a baby, you don't, if you hand the baby to somebody and the baby is like doesn't know the person. And I used to, when I was an auntie, and my nieces and nephews were tiny, and I lived around them, so I would see them almost every day. And then the grandparents would come to visit, and they'd be like, why is my, why would they rather be with you than me? I'm like, because I see them every day. Right. So being in a space of like, you get to hold them, and then they're crying, they're freaking out, and you don't know what they need. And I'm like, oh, they need this and this. And they'd be like, how did you do that? I'm like, I'm with them every day, or nearly every day. They know me. So it's a common bond, a warm bond that we formed, as opposed to like hand them over because you're supposed to. And
Yes.
our society a lot of times gets stuck in what we're supposed to do. And then we end up in a bad space because, like for example, like when I got older and I was in a relationship, and I saw, looking back on it, every freaking red flag that was possible. And I was in a space where I said no repeatedly, and I was date raped. And you know being in the space of like, we never talked about it, so I had no idea like that I was supposed to report. I didn't know any of those things. And I hear people now like, talking to like high schoolers, and and I'm like, that's an important conversation. Telling young men, like when I went to college, and they had the conversation about, as part of orientation, don't drink. If someone is drinking and someone is doing things and you're not sober, step back. You would way rather step back and not have anything happen and not have your name muddied and not have he said, she said going on than having a traumatic event that then ripples. And then we have a bigger issue. And trying to teach people, even like a lot of cultures, right, are like men are dominant, men get what they want. We don't want to upset men.
Right.
And I'm
Well,
like,
here's
I don't
one
like,
thing that I'm sure you've experienced, just like it came it came to light in my life with my daughter as she was, growing up little, and I would visit relatives and they were like, come over here, or give me a hug or a kiss, and she would refuse. And then I would get yelled at. It's like, why won't she give me a hug or a kiss? It's like, because she doesn't feel like it. And if she doesn't want to, she doesn't have to. If she doesn't feel comfortable, but I'm the grandpa or I'm the uncle, I'm like, it doesn't matter who you are.
mm-hmm.
It's okay for her, if she doesn't feel comfortable giving you a hug, not to give you a hug.
Yep.
And I think, again, going back to the culture where we're like, okay, that's the family member, you have to hug them and kiss them, otherwise, it's not nice. You have to be nice, you have to be respectful.
Mm-hmm.
And we're teaching the children that these behaviors are okay, even though they don't feel comfortable, even though the
Mm-hmm.
child doesn't feel safe. So now
Mm-hmm.
they're afraid to say, well, Uncle so and so kind of hugged me or kissed me a little weird, because I think it's supposed to be normal.
Yes.
And now you have these conflicting things in your head as a child, because you're getting misinformation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because your body's telling you, something inside of you is telling you, this doesn't feel right, this doesn't look right, get away. But then you have mom and dad in the back of your head saying, you have to do this, otherwise you're not a good girl, this is what you're supposed to do, and this is okay. And that child, is not able to make the right decision.
Yeah, and I think too is that space of the abandonment wound coming up is like,
Mm-hmm.
I'll leave, you're going to be out of the family if you don't do this. And it's not necessarily that people even say, like, I've had people say, well, I would never say it to my child. I'm like, you didn't have to. You told them that you were going to be a good girl, that they need to be a good girl and accept this. So they're in a space where 20, and I would tell people, and I have even said it, to people raising, younger girls now, is saying, in 20 years, she's at a bar, she's meeting men, she's dating people, she's trying to find her future husband. Do you want her in a space where she's letting somebody violate her boundaries, violate her space? I get that it happened to you. It wasn't okay then. So I would rather teach them now and say, hey, if you don't feel like hugging or kissing or whatever, so and so, you don't have to. I'm like, you're not an object. So if you're walking through a bar, no one has the right to slap you on the butt. No one has the right to do anything that you don't feel comfortable doing. That doesn't mean we turn around and necessarily, knock him in the eye or whatever, but it does say that we hold the firm boundary and say, look, I don't want to be touched. That does not feel good for me. And we get to say those things. And again, if we're in a space and, and to explain this to people for another, give you another layer is, if you're in a space where as an adult, when you were a child, you were taught a certain thing, because this is our parents and our grandparents, right? Is they were always taught that you need to be a good girl. They never considered that to be mental or emotional trauma.
Yeah, very
So for
true.
them, they have this notion still, again, it's an unhealed wound about how people show up. And so they've taught their daughters or their sons how to do things and not ever told them like, hey, you don't have to do this. And then so when you say as a parent now that their grandchildren, and you're in the space of like, no, if you don't want to hug uncle whoever or grandpa whoever, you don't have to. If you don't feel like hugging people right now or kissing everybody, you don't have to. And being in the space of, if you ever feel like someone has touched you inappropriately or someone has said something inappropriate to you or whatever, or been like, hey, let's go take a bath or let's go do this, and whatever, so many of us have either molestation things or other sexual stuff that happened to us, that lines were crossed and blurred because nobody ever said where the line was. People said, be nice and be a good girl. So someone knew the words to say, hey, if you be a good girl and, whatever. And a lot of us don't realize how insidious that was. And then we have our grandparents and our grandparents now going, our parents who are now grandparents, and they're like, well, how come we're doing it this way? And it's like, well, because we're teaching them boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
We're teaching them to say, your body is sovereign. Your body is your body. If you don't want it to be touched, you don't have to be touched. And if you're in the space of like, well, little kids, I'm like, no, little kids is actually the highest level up to age 9, is 2 to 9 is actually the highest level of child molestation that kids don't know the words for. So they don't say anything, and things, horrific abuse happens. And, I'm not saying that everybody that ever said, be a good girl has experienced this, but I will tell you that the experience of it, the incidence of it is skyrocketingly far higher. It's probably not even the right word, but the point of fact is much higher than we talk about, much higher than we know about, because we're so cloaked in, you got to be a good girl, or, well, they're family, so they're okay to hug and whatever. And, being in a space where, just as a very snapshot example, and again, I'm not saying this and like everybody this happens in every family, not at all. But what I am saying is being in a space where I had a client about 3 years ago who was talking to her cousins she hadn't talked to in like years. Somebody had passed away. They're at the funeral. They're all having dinner after the funeral, whatever. And they end up finding out that like 15 of 18 cousins, and I'm getting chills talking about it, had all been molested by the same uncle. And it's like, all of a sudden, it's like this whole huge, like, all these cousins, like, I can take a breath. Like when I would say things, it was like, well, don't talk about that because it hurts so-and-so's feelings, or don't talk about that because, that's just, it's like, okay, but he chose to do a thing, and this person knew about it and chose to cover it up. And it's like, well, did they know? It's like, well, that person's dead. It's like, okay, but the fact of the matter is we still get to heal. We still get to say, I will not let my children, my future grandchildren, my future great grandchildren suffer this. I know better. I get to do better.
So, Julie, what was the process for you, your healing process, to get over this trauma? What were the steps that you took?
So when I first realized, I had talked about when I had incidents of molestation as a child, and then also in high school. And it was talking to counselors a little bit, but pretty much it was like, okay, no big deal. So my really getting into healing was having a friend of mine in 2011 say, you're not okay, you need a therapist. You need to go get an accountability partner. Yeah, I'm going to be your accountability partner. I don't care what you talk about. So I ended up going to a traditional therapist for about 1.5 years. And then I found, I went to a very specific rape crisis center in 2013 and healed my rape with a very specific rape crisis counselor. And then I found energy mentoring in 2014 and have had the same energy mentor on and off since 2014. But the process, really was to get in the nitty gritty, was talking about it, was saying the things out loud. I remember going to the rape crisis center and being mortified that I was going to die, that saying out loud that I had been raped, I was going to die. It was the middle of June. It was a sunny day. Nobody on earth, which was really unusual for me at the time, but nobody on earth knew I was there. I walked in the rape crisis center, said that I was raped out loud, and, got a counselor, told her the whole story. And I was looking out the window, and she said, why are you looking out the window, if I may ask? And I said, I'm waiting for the lightning bolt to strike me dead. Because so many of us, and it's, kind of humorous now, but at the time, so many of us have this notion, again, like we talked about earlier, where it's ingrained in our brain that if we talk about it, that you're going to bring shame to your family. And, I had enough shame for, generations to not have in my own self in one incident. And so I talked about it, And I went through and talked through weekly. And basically it was probably, I think, 8-ish months of weekly counseling until I got to a point where and at one point in there it was twice, I went twice a week. And it was just like when we hit a particular bump, and being able to take a breath and being able to be in the space of like, I said it out loud, nobody died. I went and told my mom. I originally told her when my rape had happened. I told her a couple weeks after it happened. And I went to her and said, hey, I'm, getting rape crisis counseling, and I'm doing this and doing this. And I just wanted you to know. And, part of the thing with, going to counseling is taking the blame and the shame out of things, and the guilt and the verbiage, and being in the space of, I take responsibility for my life. And I remember when I went to my counselor, it was a general therapist, and, talking through things with her and being able to say the thing. And she said, what I noticed about you is that you tend to take responsibility for everything. You take over responsibility. And she said, people do that because if they feel like if it's their fault, then they can fix it. They can find the way out. Where if other people in the family aren't taking responsibility, they're like, well, how do I fix this if nobody wants to own that it's a problem? And so you and your brain, your child brain still goes, okay, if I take responsibility for this, then I can fix it. As opposed to giving people their stuff, letting them be where they are in their process, which again, is really hard for a lot of us because we want to fix it, heal it, change it. And we want everybody else to also admit that they did wrong in our eyes and validate for us, as opposed to saying, what, I know this happened. And it doesn't matter what you think of it. But I also didn't want to drag anybody through the mud. I just wanted to heal. I mean, my goal, I remember walking into my therapist's office and she's like, what's your big goal? I said, I want to be happy. I want to find happiness. I had this notion of happiness was over there. It was over there. It was in this thing. If I had the car, the house.
We always believe that everything is outside of us, right? If I do this, if I go into this career, or
Yes.
if I change the way I look, if I move into this home, or if I move to this place, if I go into this relationship, then I'll find happiness. But the truth is, the happiness you cultivate it from within. It's born from within, and you can't get that until you get through all that clutter.
Yes. And I think that, a lot of times people get into a space of, if I just change up this thing externally, and I always end up telling people, like, okay, you can get a new job, but you're going to bring you with you. And you contributed to your unhappiness at your job. And your unhappiness, the common denominator in every relationship you have is you. So if you're not happy, people are just reflecting your stuff back to you. And being in a space of like, I would tell people, your happiness that you want is underneath all your crap. So what's the shortcut? Is there a shortcut way? Do the work. Admit it, own your stuff. Don't put it on other people. Being in the space of, my process was, coming into the space of taking responsibility. And a big piece for me was changing my language. So saying, I take responsibility. There is no fault. There is no blame. I don't want to shame anybody. I don't want to guilt anybody, because those are all actually covert control mechanisms. So for the space of, you don't want to bring shame on the family, so don't talk about this, as opposed to saying, like, we don't want to talk about this because nobody wants to take responsibility, as opposed to saying, this happened to me. This part was my responsibility. This part was not my responsibility, and this is what I'm doing to heal it. This is what I'm doing to take care of it so that I can be healthy. Like, I control what I put in my mouth. I control what I put in my ears. I control who I'm around. I control what I ingest in every sense. And when I was able to shift that language and shift those pieces, right, I was able to be in a space of, okay, now that I know what I have, I have the toys that I'm responsible for, and I have the things that are not my responsibility, but I also can't do anything about. Where am I at? Because a lot of times when we get to the space of, where am I in that, this is my conversation, and being able to say, part of the thing too that's important is when I started having conversations and I switched the word from confrontation to conversation, it shifted things, because nobody likes confrontation.
Of course not.
But if we can be in a space of, I would like to have a conversation about this and this, I take responsibility. I see, I. You're not saying you did this, you're responsible. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because when we start pointing fingers, human nature is to get defensive. Human nature is to close our ears, close our eyes. I don't see it, I don't hear it, I'm not responsible for it. That's on you. I'm not to blame. It's not my fault. As opposed to saying there's no fault involved. I'm simply saying this happened to me. And at one point, I remember saying in one situation, I'm not looking for anyone to validate it. I'm not looking for anybody to do anything with it. I'm just telling you, I needed to heal from this. So I did this. This is what I'm doing. This is what I'm learning. And it's interesting how when you take those things off and you change the language, people listen.
Mm-hmm.
How can I support you? What can I do? And even if it was in some way, like there was someone I had a conversation with and they said, I'm so sorry that I didn't do anything about it. Thank you. And I wasn't looking for the apology. I was just saying, this is where I'm at. This is what I
Right.
experienced.
But
I'm so sorry.
the universe will bring you to you exactly what you need, as once you go
Yes.
through that healing process, you will receive those things that you need at that time. So,
Yes.
Jilly, now you're helping others through this
Yes.
process. So tell us a little bit about how do you help individuals through their traumas?
So I am a trauma and emotion coach. And what that means is I get to hold space for people. And what that, I am a healer, but it's, when I talk about, healing, I get to hold the space. And what holding the space looks like for me is with my clients is I get to listen to you, share your story. Sometimes I'm reframing things for you. Sometimes I'm just purely listening and saying, I hear you. I see you. That had to be really hard. Um, and again, it depends on the situation, but generally speaking, is we get to a space where they get to feel their emotions. Their emotions are entirely valid. So if they're angry, they get to be angry. If they're sad, they get to be sad. If they're raging, they get to be raging. If they're just grief stricken or whatever they're feeling, I get to hold the space for them to allow them to be in that emotion, to be in that space, to be in that story without having to fix it or change it or do anything with it. And then the healing a lot of times takes place with they get to say,
Thank
thank
you
you for
for
healing me.
for
Yes.
allowing me, giving that space to get it
Yes.
off my chest. And sometimes that's all that people need, is for somebody to hold that space for them. So
100%.
give them that space where they can freely just speak
Yes.
what they've wanted to speak, that they haven't been allowed to, just get it off their chest, get it off their body and release it. So that
Yes.
is wonderful. Jilly, where can people find you?
My website, jilliemaria.com, JILLIEMARIA.com. They can also find me on Facebook. And I have a Facebook group that I would love for people to join, Awakening with Grace. And it's a spiritual group, spiritual space where you get to flex your spiritual muscles and ask questions and deepen your intuition. So yeah, would love to have everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please like and share and subscribe. Until next week.